This episode of The Construction Record is brought to you by the Greater Toronto Sewer and Water Main Contractors Association. Clean water, our goal, our future.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 60 of the Construction Record podcast. This is Vince Versace, National Managing Editor of the Daily Commercial News and Journal of Commerce, joining you today. As far as our daily commercial news update and the things that have been catching our attention and we've been working on here in the DCN newsroom, there are two items in particular that have really percolated and come to the fore over the last couple of days before we recorded this podcast. One in particular, it's on a sad note. Here in Ontario, former infrastructure minister David Caplan suddenly passed away overnight on Wednesday, July 24th. The news broke on the morning of Thursday, July 25th. Why this is significant to the construction industry is that David was a champion of infrastructure, and many stakeholders in the industry considered him a friend to construction no matter the political stripe. I had the pleasure of interviewing and meeting David before my stint started here at the Daily Commercial News, and during my time here when I was a reporter. Didn't talk to him or communicate with him as much once I kind of climbed up the ranks here on the team, but that's neither here nor there. David always made the time for my reporters, whether freelance or staff, and he was always a pleasure to talk to, and the industry is shocked. David spearheaded a lot of initiatives that have shaped what Ontario infrastructure looks like today. He was appointed Minister of Public Infrastructure and Renewal back in 2003. He led that newly established standalone infrastructure ministry. Under his leadership, there were a lot of initiatives put in place that led to the modernization of the province's infrastructure, stakeholders have said. Staff writer Angela Gismondi went around the horn and talked to a lot of the stakeholders in the industry that had interactions and knew David, both professionally and then personally through those professional interactions. And here's a snippet of some of the things that those folks had to say. Clive Thurston, president of the Ontario General Contractors Association, said, to his credit, that is David's, he reached out to the industry and asked us to work with him, to play a significant role in setting up the whole ministry. That is the first infrastructure standalone ministry for Ontario. It was a lot of work, and he took it from its infancy to what we see today. His last interaction with the industry formally, for folks who aren't familiar with David, is he was appointed Chief Operating Officer of the Ontario Road Builders Association back in November 2017. So here was David after leaving political life, once again coming into the construction fold and working with the road builders. And Orba had this to say in a statement. Orba was privileged to call on the services of Mr. Caplan, whose knowledge of Ontario's infrastructure sector was unsurpassed. The construction industry and the Orba community in particular are shocked and saddened to hear David Caplan's passing. One of the key initiatives that David set up, and I remember interviewing him about this, was he was the first minister to really engage stakeholders in construction through a specific construction advisory committee. When I joined the DCN, so many stakeholders and leaders that dealt with the province talked about this committee, especially once it went away too. So Ian Cunningham had to say on this point. He had a construction advisory committee. He was the last minister to have it, and that provided him with advice about issues and concerns of the industry. He was exceedingly accessible for me. He was friendly, engaging, and nonpartisan. He seemed to be not only respected but liked by everybody in the construction industry and also by all political parties. Really, that's kind of a key point, and that's the one thing I learned about David, was he was liked across the board, across the political spectrum in the construction industry. And I think the comments by Rob Bradford, he's a former Daily Commercial News Editorial Advisory Board member, former head of the Ontario Road Builders Association, and now he's executive director with the Toronto Area Road Builders Association. I think Rob summed it up best, and I'll leave it with this. He was engaged and always listened, said Rob Bradford. Apart from being a dedicated public servant for all the right reasons, David was a down-to-earth everyman, and I enjoyed talking with him over coffee or a cold beer on more than one occasion. He He would rather do what was right than what was expedient. A breath of fresh air in a tough business. And I think that best describes Mr. Caplan. So on this note, I like to express our condolences from the Daily Commercial News family and staffers, both current and past, that interacted with Mr. Caplan. And posthumously, we thank him for all the time he made for us. And the construction industry is saddened by his passing. So wanted to lead off with that as far as the DCN. There's a reaction story that is up online at dcnonl.com, and you can catch up with all the perspectives and reflections of some of the construction stakeholders we talked to as it concerned Mr. Caplan's passing. Another story that has been of interest to us that's percolated, and it's actually catching international eyes now, is the 30-meter telescope project in Hawaii on Mauna Kea. Construction is slated to be started. Materials were starting to be moved up to the mountaintop this week. And Canada plays a major role in the building of this Eye to the Sky, this new incredible telescope that is proposed to be built there. And Don Wall, our staff writer, dove in and talked to one of the folks involved with the construction of this project. When completed, the 30-meter telescope will have a 30-meter diameter lens, which will have 9 times the light-gathering power of the current generation of telescopes. It's really going to take astronomical observations to another level. And those of you that have been lucky enough to go to Mauna Kea in Hawaii and go to the current observatories there, it is spectacular, especially the public viewing areas at night. I'm a bit of an astronomy geek, so just putting it out there. When I visited, it was literally Christmas. The science that would be collected through this telescope would be incredible. At the same time, the concerns of native Hawaiian leaders about this telescope that's going to be built even further high up on Mauna Kea, on lands that are important to them culturally, are legitimate, their concerns. And it's interesting to see where this plays out, because construction is set to be started, and Canada has a contribution to this project, and Canadian Indigenous leaders have now expressed their dismay with Canada's involvement in the project. And we have all these sentiments, really, we've been tracking them, whether it's through Don's story, which is strictly about the Canadian construction contribution to the project, which concerns the actual dome and structure in which the telescope will be housed in, or whether it's through our coverage through the Associated Press and Canadian Press, looking at the issues that protesters have expressed. It's definitely a worthy story to catch up on and observe. So before I throw to Warren and Russ in the Burnaby office to give you their Western perspectives, just wanted to let you know that after their Western update is done, you'll hear a featured interview that Don did with one of the Canadian proponents on that project. Once again, if you want to catch up on everything construction related in Canada, please visit dcnonl.com or joconl.com, and you'll catch up on all the news that you need to know. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, thanks, Vince. It's Warren Fry, digital media editor at the Journal of Commerce.
I'm Russell Hickson, staff writer at the Journal.
And it's been a busy week, so Russell, why don't you start us out with what you've been working on?
Yeah, we just published a story on our website about workers' compensation review in BC. Mm-hmm. This is kind of a developing story. The review has been going on since April, and then the report for the review is due September 30th, mm-hmm. I believe. But the time period for participating in the review just ended on July 19th. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people in the construction industry are unhappy with it. I heard...
Do tell.
Oh, I will tell. So they've signed a submission. Pretty much every major construction association in the province, as well, and as well as a bunch of other kind of construction-related kind of organizations have signed, saying they believe that the review has been very vaguely defined, and the timing of it has been very inconvenient. Mm-hmm. And so we can talk about kind of the vagueness. The province has said they want a more worker-centered workers' compensation system. They also talked about how they want to evaluate their policies through a gender and diversity-based analysis. and they haven't really defined specifically what things they're going to be assessing,
Mm-hmm.
and I think that has frustrated a lot in the industry. And they also talked about these two reports that they're relying on. One's I'm going to probably say this wrong, Bagoyo report, which talks about options for the accident fund,
Mm-hmm.
and the other report that they're using is called the Petrie report. I'm probably saying that wrong too, and that talks about restoring balance and making the system more worker-centered. And that has to do with timing, not the report, but the report's release has to do with the issue with timing, especially the Bagoyo one, which was released to the public on the 19th.
Yeah.
So the day that these groups, the deadline that they have for participating in the review was the day one of the major reports that the review is relying on was released. So they didn't have any time to review it.
It's not optimal.
Or to assess it, and that has frustrated a lot of them. So they've kind of let the government know that they're frustrated about it. So it remains to be seen what's going to happen. And I've contacted the government asking, why would you set the deadline for participating in this review the same day you release a report that's integral to the review?
Yeah, that doesn't make
That seems like an
sense.
obvious question.
Yeah.
So we'll see what the province says, and if they have any sort of changes based on the submission.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see what happens. Next, kind of interesting story for the region was to do with SkyTrain. And
Okay, yes.
this has been bouncing around for a long time. Years ago, they wanted to do LRT at street level, and then when Doug McCallum, the mayor of Surrey, was elected, he scrapped it, and they kind of tossed away years and years and years of work and planning that they'd done, which frustrated some people.
These are slower moving than SkyTrains, right? These are like the trolleys essentially. Yeah.
Well, they're at
Or
street
what
level.
they
They're
were
at street
trolleys,
level.
they're not anymore. Yeah.
They're at street level. So Mayor McCallum said, no, we're going to build SkyTrain, and he told everybody I can build it for roughly the same. So I think he said 1.65 billion or something.
Okay.
He said we can get SkyTrain to Langley for that. That's the priority. He's like, I'd rather do that, and I can do it for not very expensive.
And for those that don't live in the Lower Mainland, Langley is one of the bigger suburbs and also not really connected at all by transit other than bus.
Very fast growing.
It's not well served by transit as is basically.
No, not really. It's kind of, you got to go east on the highway to get to Langley.
And it's kind of a no-brainer for the SkyTrain, frankly. Honestly.
Yeah, well, they've been planning. They have the track just stops in Surrey Central, and it's just waiting to be extended.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so TransLink kind of released their preliminary business case for it, and they said, yeah, we can get SkyTrain to Langley, but it costs about $3.12 billion, which is actually well within the mayor's 10-year plan, the mayor's council's, which is a collection of Metro Vancouver mayors.
And usually these things also get funded by the federal and provincial government. I don't know if this one is, but that generally is what happens.
I'll get to that.
Yeah.
The first kind of phase of it is funded. So there's about let's see here. Let me consult my notes for 1 second. Yeah, it's already funded for $1.65 billion. So I think that they're going to move ahead on planning. I think they voted today. They said we're going to complete some more detailed planning and move ahead with that for the leg of to get to Fleetwood, which is a neighborhood in Surrey. Which isn't to Langley, but it's a start.
Getting closer, yeah.
It's getting there.
It's like the Broadway thing, not going quite to UBC yet.
Yeah, so I think what they're gonna do is as more funding becomes available, they'll go ahead and start on this because this is fully funded. They can just build it now. They can plan it and build it, get it going. But the other parts they're gonna in the meantime have to kind of figure out how they're gonna fund them, and then I think those will happen later. So, but progress is being made, and then I think they're going to have kind of a more full business case in January next year.
And I've also been doing some stories. I just put something together, which will be coming up soon, about there's a planned, and it hasn't been approved yet, but it's a planned 60-story tower in Vancouver's West End, and it's going to be passive house. When and if it's completed, it will be the tallest, won't be the biggest, but it'll be the tallest passive house structure in the world. And I talked to the developers, and they were telling me about the ways that they're doing things is interesting, because some passive house principles, well, they still work at that scale, but they don't look as good architecturally. So if you see like a 2 or 3 story passive house thing, they've usually got sort of extended balconies that sort of put in shade and light and sort of shape things, and so you have to use less actual central heating. For this, they don't want to do it in quite that way, so they've changed it around a bit, but they also, the technologies that we have now to not use that aren't quite to scale for this yet. So what they're doing is they're probably going to have some, they describe them as these sort of wheels that sort of scoop in the cold and hot air. But you can't just use one because it would be gigantic, and you can't put it on the top of the building either. So there's going to be 3 with sort of a main column for air, which is an interesting and innovative new way of doing things. It's also going to have this green column. So if you look throughout the middle of the building, each level, or I think every 3rd level is going to have trees in it. So like little miniature forests essentially. And that's another passive house thing, because on top of the actual, the greenery, you've also got this sort of heat exchange in the slabs, and you've got normally you don't have to worry about the fact that you've got soil and trees on top of it, but here you do. So it's a work in progress, they said, but it's a definitely interesting design thing. The other thing is that the West End it's highly regulated, because it's one of the oldest communities downtown, and
it's like this quaint little residential neighborhood of like not.
That they've kept skyscrapers for a long time, and that's changing
right
now.
In the smack of downtown, you have like this adorable little like residential neighborhood.
Yeah, I've lived there. It's a great neighborhood, and part of it is it feels like a real community and not just a bunch of buildings, right? So the city knows that, and they put out a plan a few years ago that sort of keeps that in mind, but still expands it so there's affordable housing, because there's only so many places to live there. And this is part of it. Actually, I asked them about affordable housing. They said 15 stories, the first 15 stories of this are going to be affordable, and there are 5 of affordable, I think, rental housing, market housing, and then the rest is condos probably. But so it's an interesting project, and it's one of the tallest, but also kind of falls into line with all the different rules that you have to have in the West End and other parts of the city. Vancouver generally is kind of restrictive for a lot of reasons, because you don't restrict the view of the mountains. There's just a bunch of different reasons to keep buildings not as tall as maybe some people want to build them. Anyway, so that was an interesting one. The other one I did is that the BC Supreme Court has judged, it's kind of hard to say in favor, but they've said, yes, we can hear one background, ICBA and many other local construction associations, businesses, stakeholders put a petition last year saying, hey, listen, we don't like CBAs, the community benefit agreements, and the reason we don't like it is because it's restricting workers' rights to join or not join a union, and it forces them to do so. So they put this to the BC Supreme Court. The province argued this is something for the Labor Relations Board and not for the BC Supreme Court. Essentially, yeah. And so, but the association, the petition guy said, oh, no, this is the Minister of Transportation overstepping their bounds. So the BC Supreme Court said, we think that we should hear that part of it. The part about the Minister of Transportation stepping over their bounds, that part should definitely be heard by the BC Supreme Court. This is not all a victory for them, because there's a bunch of other stuff that they're saying, no, this actually should go to the Labor Relations Board. And I talked to all of these different association heads, Chris Gardner and Fiona Famluck and Tom Sigurdsson, who was on the opposite side of the BC Building Trades, and he said, well, wait, okay, so the Minister of Transportation may have overstepped their bounds on this, or not, but there's all this other stuff that they didn't win, and he said, and I think they're on pretty thin ice going into court with what they've got.
So everyone's claiming victory.
Yeah, exactly. Everyone's claiming victory, using their finest communications weapons.
Okay.
And they're saying the opposite. They're saying, well, we won this, and next thing we want to do is do a hearing as soon as we possibly can. So watch this space, but it's interesting that some movement has actually happened with that.
The case is proceeding.
The case is proceeding, and it's proceeding sort of in the way that the petitioners wanted it to.
Well, partially, I guess.
Yeah,
it's partially proceeding.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So, with that, we're going to go on an interview with staff writer Don Wall.
This feature interview is brought to you by the Ontario Sewer and Water Main Construction Association, Ontario's champion for sustainable and safe water and sewer infrastructure.
Could you talk about taking scientific discovery from the idea stage and from scholarly articles into, and moving it forward into the stage where it's going to be something that's materials and devices that are going to be assembled in this in this wonderful telescope building. So you're involved in shepherding that along, I imagine. Talk about that process, and getting into the hardware.
I love your question. How do you get the science into the hardware?
Yeah.
Which is a passion of mine. So first of all, it's very important to emphasize that science is at the root of it all. Mm-hmm. And so every part of the observatory can be traced to a scientific purpose. And we actually developed a elaborate process to tie science to hardware and keep those ties alive as we change the hardware to make it better suited for the science. So you start with a science case. You look at what the science case requires. Mm-hmm. So let's take, for example, the search for planets around other stars. Mm-hmm. Okay, what do I need? Obviously, I need a big telescope. I need very good optics. I need adaptive optics. I need a spectrograph instrument. And so you decompose the requirements for the science into a set of construction requirements for the hardware. Mm-hmm. Or I should say design requirements, because that's the next step. So then you enter the design stage using the science requirements. You try to find the best solution to meet those requirements, and hopefully you'll be successful in meeting them all, but not always. Yeah. There are trade-offs that need to be studied and decided upon. And then once you're done with the design, then you're ready to enter fabrication. So you fabricate all the parts, you put them together in your lab, you test them, and then once you're happy with it, you deconstruct everything, you ship them to the site, and then you install the hardware on the telescope.
Yeah, where has a lot of this process been done? Especially the last phase you talked about, preparing the devices.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of the Canadian contribution to TNT, a lot of it is being done in Victoria, British Columbia, at our research center. So we have teams of scientists and engineers working with the university communities in doing all these steps. Mm-hmm. So every step of the way, there's these people involved, and we also involve industry in our design efforts. So, for example, the AO system is being designed and will be fabricated in close collaborations with industrial partners across Canada.
Yeah. Okay. Could you go over, so what will be the final pieces of... what will be the final set of instruments that Canada will be contributing?
So
we're name them and describe them.
Okay. Well, so if we look in terms of the Canadian, we call them deliverables. Yeah. The big pieces, there's three of them. The first one is not an instrument. It's the dome that will shield the telescope from the elements. The second deliverable is the adaptive optics system. Mm-hmm. So this is a system, I call them super goggles, that will sharpen the vision of the telescope to give you images as if they were taken from space. Yeah. And so this is the second big deliverables. And the third one is a science instrument. Actually, we're collaborating in that instrument. We're one of the big partners in the instrument. It's called IRIS, for the Infrared Imaging Spectrometer. Mm-hmm. And IRIS will be one of the first light instruments. Yeah. And we are involved in some of the sensors and the software that will go into this instrument.
Yeah. Are those three components, are they interrelated? Is there a natural fit between them, or are they different divisions and different types of people working on them?
So Nefarious and Iris are, even though we look at them as separate things, are part of a single system. Yeah. So we are designing and we will be building the AO system here in Victoria. Mm-hmm. And once it's ready to accept Iris, the Iris team will deliver the instrument in Victoria, and they will be tested and run together for a year and a half to really thoroughly debug both of them separately and as a system. And once we're happy with the results, both Nepharius and Iris will be disassembled and shipped to the TMT observatory itself to be reassembled and then retested and recommissioned on the telescope.